Chapter 4. The Harvest. The days went by so swiftly that it was hard to tell them apart, and all the time the grain was growing steadily taller and more golden. Even the wheat in the field that Red Boy had trampled grew well, and all over the land slaves worked from morning until night watering the fields. Finally, one afternoon, when all the family was sitting in the garden, Ani came and knelt before Sakaris. "See, master," he said, "the grain is ripe." He held in his hands a full yellow ear of wheat. "Good," said Sakaris. "Then we will begin to harvest tomorrow." The next morning, Kafi and Sari were in the fields while the sun was still low in the east. But early as they were, the slaves were there before them. The curved blades of their sickles flashed in the sun as they worked. As soon as they finished cutting the grain, other slaves bound the stalks into sheaves and packed them into baskets, which they loaded on the backs of donkeys. Then women and children picked up all the heads of grain that had been broken off in harvesting. Nothing was ever wasted in Egypt. There were too many hungry people to be fed. When the patient little donkeys were loaded, they were led off to the threshing floor. This was a large square of hard-packed earth. Kafi and Sari followed the donkey train and were just in time to see the first grain of the harvest dumped upon the floor. "What do they do that for?" asked Sari. "You'll see," answered Kafi. "They are bringing Sut and Nep now." One of the slaves drove the 2 oxen straight onto the threshing floor, and then round it, and back and forth until the stalks of grain were all crushed and broken. "What a strange thing to do!" exclaimed Sari. "No, it isn't," Kafi told her. "They have to do that to separate the kernels of grain from the stalks. But it can't be separated. Look at it," said Sari. "They haven't finished yet," said Kafi patiently. 6 women slaves with white cloths tied around their heads walked out onto the threshing floor. Each one carried 2 curved paddles in her hands. They began to pick up the grain on the paddles and toss it into the air. A little breeze was blowing. It carried away all the dust and broken stalks, but the heavy kernels of grain fell back on the floor. When they had finished, only a pile of clean kernels was left. Day after day, the harvesting went on, and each night saw more grain stored away in the granary. "It won't take many more days to finish," said Kafi one afternoon as they went back to the villa. "Let's ask Father when the harvest holiday will be." "What's a holiday?" asked Sari. "Why, a day when nobody works, and we all take gifts to the temple, and there are feasts, and everybody has a good time." They found Sakaris and Nasha in the arbor. Sakaris was reading a letter which was written on thin strips of papyrus pasted together. The writing looked like a lot of little black pictures. "Father," called Kafi as soon as he saw his father and mother, "when is the holiday going to be?" "A week from today," answered Sakaris. "Who is your letter from?" asked Nasha as the 2 children came up. "From Anatep," said Sakaris. "What does he want?" asked Nasha. "He wants to bring his new bull to fight Red Boy when he comes to the harvest feast," answered Sakaris. "Did you invite Anatep to the feast?" asked Kafi in surprise. "Yes," answered Sakaris, smiling. "I thought it might make him feel better about your taking Sari right out from under his nose." "And are you going to let him bring his bull?" asked Kafi. "I don't know what to do about that," said Sakaris. "I am almost sure Red Boy will win, for he is the best bull in this part of Egypt, and Anatep wouldn't like that." "But," said Nasha, "Anatep suggested it himself, so it will be his own fault if his bull is beaten." "That's true," said Sakaris. "I suppose I may as well let him bring the bull. It's a new one Anatep had just bought, and of course he wants to try him out. But I hope Red Boy will not beat him too badly," he added. The next week passed very slowly. Kafi and Sari thought the holiday would never come, but of course it finally did. And what an exciting day it was. Everybody at the villa and everybody in all the little mud brick houses where the slaves lived was up very early that morning. They all ran back and forth on errands and got into each other's way, and they were all very happy, and nobody minded in the least. At least Sakaris and Nasha and Kafi, with Sari beside him, came out of the villa and stepped into their litters. The slaves formed a long line behind them, and they all set off, carrying the gifts that Sakaris was going to take to the temple to offer the gods in thanks for the good harvest. There were so many measures of wheat, and so many lengths of fine linen, and so many jars of honey and butter and olive oil, and so many live geese and ducks, and even cows and goats, and so many slaves to carry them all, that it made a very long procession indeed. When the end of it was just leaving the villa, Sakaris and Nasha and Kafi and Sari were already turning into the road that led to the temple. Along the road, people from the nearby villages joined them and made the procession even longer. Everyone was talking and laughing, and the geese were cackling and the cattle lowing. The priests heard them coming and met them at the temple gate, their white linen headdresses and kilts and gold collars shining in the sun. They led the procession into the courtyard, then took the gifts and carried them into the temple, where they offered them to the gods. Outside in the courtyard, the people prayed and sang and watched the temple dancers as they danced in honor of the gods. Afterwards, the priest came from the temple and greeted Sakaris, and while he and Nasha talked to them, Kafi and Sari wandered around the courtyard. Sari had never seen such a big and beautiful place. Above was the blue Egyptian sky, and around the sides of the courtyard were thick stone pillars painted in bright colors. On the walls behind these were pictures of the gods and goddesses the Egyptians worshipped, so large that they made the children feel very small just to look at them. There was Hathor, the cow goddess, and Horus with his hawk's head, and a round disc with beautifully colored wings on either side that Kafi told Sari was Ra, the sun god. Then there was Geb, the earth god, lying on his back with trees and flowers growing from him, and above him was Nut, the sky goddess, her body arched and her dress all covered with stars. By the time the two children had been around the courtyard once, Sakaris and Nasha were ready to go, and the procession, empty-handed, started home. The trip to the temple was only the beginning of that wonderful day. Almost as soon as Kafi's family reached home, their guests began to arrive for the feast. They came in litters, carried by their slaves, dressed in fine white linen clothes and bright jewels and curled black wigs. At last, when it seemed as though everyone in Egypt must be there, the children saw another litter coming, and behind it slaves leading a great bull. Kafi gasped when he saw the bull, for he was enormous. He snorted and shook his head from side to side as he came, and he was coal black from his nose to the tip of his tail. Anatep stepped out of the litter at the door and greeted Sakaris and Nasha. Then he saw Kafi and Sari. "Well, Master Osirikaf," he said to Kafi, "are you still satisfied with your slave?" "Yes, sir," answered Kafi. "I thought you chose well," said Anatep, "and now she is strong and rosy and prettier than ever." He smiled with a great good humor, and nobody seeing him would ever believe that he had been angry at Kafi for buying Sari. Kafi found it hard to believe himself. Anatep then turned to Sakaris and waved his hand toward the bull. "How do you like him, Sakaris?" he asked. "He is magnificent," said Sakaris. "I am afraid that Red Boy will have a hard time to hold his own with such a one to fight. What do you call him?" "The Nubian," answered Anatep. "I think he is indeed a fit opponent for Red Boy. That bull of yours has never met his match before. This should be a treat for your guests. Do you not agree?" "It should be indeed," answered Sakaris. He clapped his hands to summon the slaves. "We shall have him put into a pen until after we have refreshed ourselves with such poor food as the house affords," he said courteously. Bowing to his guests, he ordered the slaves to take the Nubian to the pen, then led Anatep through the house and into the garden. The garden looked very different from the way it did on ordinary days. There were rich rugs spread on the grass and carved chairs with soft cushions in them set around in a big circle. Wonderful odors floated out through the kitchen door, and slaves hurried to and fro with trays and bowls piled high with good things to eat. These they set on low stools where all could reach them. At last everything was ready, and everyone sat down to eat. There was no table, and there were no knives and forks and spoons. The guests ate with their fingers and then dipped their hands into copper bowls of water that the slaves passed around. As they dined, they listened to the flute players and harpists and watched the graceful dancing girls that Sakaris had hired to entertain them. Finally, when no one could eat another mouthful, Sakaris rose from his chair. "My friends," he said, "Anatep has brought his new bull, the Nubian, to fight Red Boy. If it would please you to see this match, pray come with me." Kafi and Sari did not wait to hear any more. They dashed out through the kitchen and ran to the pen where Anatep's slaves were getting the Nubian ready for the fight. They were fitting smooth wooden balls on the ends of his horn. "Why do they do that when they are going to fight?" asked Sari. "Because," answered Kafi, "nobody wants his bull to be really hurt. This way they just struggle together, and the one that is downed first loses." "Do you think Red Boy can beat the Nubian?" Sari asked anxiously. Kafi looked at the powerful muscles that rippled beneath the Nubian's black coat. He felt a little doubtful himself, but he would not admit it. "Of course he'll win," he said. "Red Boy has never been beaten." Just then, Num came running over. "Master Kafi," he called, "your father says that it is time for you to come if you want to see the fight." He led them over to a large enclosed circle. Around it were chairs for the guests so they could sit at their ease and watch the fight. Kafi sat down next to Sakaris, and Sari sat on the ground at his feet. They had scarcely had time to settle themselves before they saw Anatep's slaves leading the Nubian from his pen. He was rearing and pawing the earth and lowering his horns at the slaves. Behind him came Sakaris' slave with Red Boy. When both bulls were safely shut in the ring, the people rose to their feet and cheered and shouted to make them angry. That was not hard to do because both animals had been starved since the day before, and they were naturally fierce anyway. They capered around the ring for a minute or two, then lowered their great heads, bellowed, and ran straight at each other. They struck each other's heads so hard that it seemed as if they must have cracked their skulls, but they only staggered back a step or two, shook themselves, and then circled off to charge again as fiercely as before. This time they locked horns and struggled and snorted in the middle of the ring until the air was filled with clouds of dust. Time after time they ran at each other while everybody shouted to anger them even further. They reared and plunged, and the ground shook with the pounding of their hoofs as they charged. "They're indeed well matched," called Sakaris to Anatep above the noise. Anatep nodded, but did not take his eyes from the two animals, now about to charge again. "He looks as if he were watching for something," thought Kafi to himself. He heard the sound of running hooves and turned back to the fight. Red Boy and the Nubian were charging head-on. Then Kafi saw the Nubian duck his head beneath Red Boy's horns and go straight for his broad white chest. To everyone's surprise, Red Boy bellowed with pain and, twisting away, tore around the ring with the Nubian close at his heels. Only as the two bulls came toward them did Kafi see that the white patch on Red Boy's chest seemed to be shrinking and getting red like the rest of his coat. But it was a different shade of red, and suddenly Kafi realized that Red Boy had been wounded. Sari tugged at his kilt. "Kafi, Kafi," she was crying. "Look, the Nubian has lost the ball off one of his horns." After that, nobody knew quite what was happening for a few minutes. There was a great deal of shouting and bellowing and ropes flying through the air and dust in such thick clouds that it was hard to see what was going on. But in the end, the slaves managed to rope the two bulls. They took the Nubian back to his pen, still bellowing because he wanted to finish the fight, and they led Red Boy off to the stables, roaring because he was hurt. The children started off after Red Boy. Just ahead of them were Sakaris and Anatep. They heard Anatep say, "It was a most unfortunate accident. The slave who fitted the balls on Nubian's horns shall be well beaten." When they reached the stables, they found that Red Boy had been tied to a stall, and the slaves were trying to treat his wounded chest. There was a long crimson gash where the Nubian had gored him, and every time anyone tried to touch him, Red Boy roared and plunged and shook his horns so that no one could get near him, even though he was tied. And all the time, the great gash was bleeding more and more. It seems as if he would bleed to death if something could not be done soon. Sari's father, Ben, had come into the stable with the rest. He stood there watching all that went on. At last, he said, "I have treated many animals in my own country. Perhaps I might be able to treat Red Boy's wound." Sakaris made his mind quickly. "You have to leave to do anything you can, Ben," he said. "No one else seems to be able to do anything, not even the head of my stables. At that, the slave who had charge of the stable slunk back into the shadows as quickly as he could. "Thank you, master," said Ben. "There's just one thing I ask." "What is it?" asked Sakaris. "That I may be left alone with the bull. Having so many people around excites him as much as the pain of his wound." "Very well," said Sakaris, and led the way out into the sunshine. Sakaris and Kafi went back to the villa and busied themselves for the next few minutes with saying goodbye to their guests. But after everyone had gone, last of all Anatep with the Nubian bull behind him, they went back to the stables. Everything there was quiet now. Red Boy had stopped his bellowing. They peeped in at the door. Ben was squatting on the floor waiting for them, and in his stall, Red Boy was contentedly munching hay. There was a broad white linen bandage across his chest. Sakaris smiled. "Well done, Ben," he said. "You have a way with animals. I marked it the day Red Boy treed the children. You would rather care for animals than farm, would you not?" "Yes, master, if I have my choice," answered Ben. "You shall have it," said Sakaris. "From now on, you are to have charge of all the animals on my land. When a man has such a gift, it is foolish to waste it in a wheat field." For the first time since he had lived at the villa, Ben smiled. "It is no hard lot to be a slave with you as master, Sakaris," he said. "I thank you, and I shall care for your herds as well as I am able. But before you go," he added, "may I have leave to go back to the ring where the fight was held? I want to look for something." "Certainly," said Sakaris. "What is it you wish to find?" "I would rather not say until I found it," said Ben. "Take us with you," clamored Kafi and Sari. Ben sounded very mysterious. Ben nodded, and Sakaris went back to the villa. "Won't you tell us, Father, what you're looking for?" asked Sari as they reached the ring. "We might help you find it." Ben opened the gate. "So you might," he said. "I am looking for the ball that came off the Nubian's horn." "The ball that came off the Nubian's horn!" exclaimed Kafi. "What do you want to find that for?" "Because I'm a very curious man," answered Ben, and refused to say another word. For several minutes they searched through the ring, shuffling their feet through the soft dust without finding anything. Then Kafi hit something with his foot. He picked it up. It was a half of the wooden ball they were looking for. "It must have cracked in two when the Nubian charged Red Boy," said Kafi, handing it to Ben. Ben rubbed the dirt off the little piece of wood and looked at it carefully. He seemed well pleased with what he saw. "I think your father would like to see this," he said to Kafi. "Shall we take it to him?" "But don't you want the other half?" asked Sari. "We don't need it. This is enough," answered Ben. With the two children beside him, almost bursting with curiosity, he started toward the house. Sakaris and Nasha were in the garden. Ben knelt on the grass before Sakaris. "Master Kafi found what I was looking for," he said. "It is part of the ball from the Nubian's horn." Sakaris took the broken ball and turned it over and over. Kafi hung over his shoulder, and Sari hung over Kafi's shoulder. They all looked at it carefully. The ball had been broken right in half, but along one side of the break was a dark gray line. When he saw that, Kafi began to understand. "I see," he cried. "The ball was cracked before the Nubian went into the fight. That dark streak is part of the old crack where the wood was weathered and turned gray." Ben smiled, and Sakaris said, "You're right, Kafi." "But Anatep probably didn't know the ball was cracked," said Nasha. Kafi remembered how Anatep had looked as though he were waiting for something when he was watching the fight. "I think he did know," Kafi said excitedly, then told them what he had seen. "But why would he want to do such a thing?" asked Nasha. "We do not know that he did," answered Sakaris, "and we shall probably never know. He may have been trying to get even with me for letting Kafi buy Sari." "But how foolish," said Nasha. Sakaris sent Ben and Sari away, then rose from his chair and began to pace up and down the garden path. "The thing that puzzles me even more than the matter of the wooden ball," he said, "is where Anatep got the money to buy a bull like the Nubian. He spent all the wealth his father left him long ago, and he certainly did not have much the day we met him at the slave market, or he would not have hesitated to pay 14 copper rings for a slave girl." "Do bulls like the Nubian cost more than slave girls?" asked Kafi. "Much more," answered Sakaris. "I don't understand it," he muttered half to himself and started pacing again.